Hello and welcome to this very first episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm your host, Dan Nash, PhD researcher in exercise physiology and a 2:15 marathon runner. So welcome everybody. I expect if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have a bit idea of who I am already, but yeah, just to introduce myself properly, my name's Dan. I'm doing a PhD at Cardiff Met University in exercise physiology, where my research area is the cytokine response to endurance training. Now, as part of this PhD, I also provide sports science support for Welsh Athletics and Welsh Triathlon, and I deliver their sports science support for them. So I do exercise testing and help support their elite athletes. And I'm also a runner in my own right, and I've competed over basically all the distances I've worked my way through. I've done track races, raced as low down as 800 meters, not very well, but I have done. But probably better at the longer distances. So as I said, I've done a 2:15 marathon. I've run 29:23 for 10k. But I'm also the British record for 50k on the road at 2 hours and 49 minutes. So yeah, that's me. As a bit of an introduction. But I guess I was also going to sort of mention why I thought I'd start this podcast. And I mean, it started really with you'll probably remember that back in 2020 with COVID, there was an avalanche of content being put out there. So YouTube videos and webinars. And as part of my role with Welsh Athletics, they asked me to put out a couple of webinars on the physiology of running. And you can find them on the Welsh Athletics YouTube channel. There's 3 episodes, the Physiology of Endurance Running Part 1 and Part 2, as well as the Physiology of the Masters Athlete, where I talked about how our physiology changes with aging and how we maybe need to adjust our training to take into account these changes. Anyway, they seem to prove really popular. They've had a few thousand views on YouTube between them. And it's something that I really enjoyed as well. And so ever since, I've thought about actually how can I go about sharing more of this sports science content. And I think there's a real interest for it at the moment as well. I think people are becoming increasingly interested in sports science and performance sport in general. But at the same time, there's also a lot of BS out there and a lot of overselling, I think, of sports science research. And there's certainly every time I look on the internet, there's more and more products being sold they make lots of claims, lots of very big claims. But actually, if you go back to the research, they're often overstated, or actually there really isn't the evidence base to support what they're saying at all. So I think that's sort of why I wanted to start this podcast. Because I think people are really interested in it, but also to counteract some of the misnomers that are out there, and to hopefully ground ourselves in actually the evidence base and what we do know. But also mention what we don't know. There's plenty in sport and sport performance, but actually we can't really explain so far in sports science, and it's still a reasonably new field. And yeah, we definitely don't know all the answers yet. So I think it's really important to state what we don't know and not go into go over to the other side where we're making claims about things that actually we don't necessarily know are true. So that's why I thought I'd start this podcast. In terms of structure, I'm going to basically cover one main topic per episode. And we'll do a bit of a deep dive about actually what do we know about that particular topic, and then actually break it down into really what I'm really interested in is turning this scientific knowledge into how does that inform applied practice, or actually how can we take that thing that we know and use it to make us run faster. And yeah, so one main topic per episode. And And I also want to really signpost you back to the original research, as well as point you towards researchers who are really like cutting edge in their area. So actually, who are the people to actually are doing this cutting edge research and really are the experts in their field. Yeah, in terms of frequency of the podcast, how many episodes will be coming out each week, month, etc. That's to be determined. I'm pretty busy, juggling lots of plates, and I've got a PhD to finish as well. Trying to fit in my own running, and we had a kid 6 months ago who takes a bit of our time too. So yeah, we'll just see how it goes. We'll keep it pretty informal, but I'll try and get them out as frequently as I can. So, first topic of this very first episode, this podcast, and I've chosen to talk about marathon fueling, and actually specifically, what fuel should we take on during a marathon? How can we optimize that to help our marathon performance? And there's a few reasons why I've chosen this as our first topic. Firstly, marathon season is coming up. London Marathon is just around the corner, really, and there will also be plenty of people, I'm sure, travelling out to Europe to take part in marathons out there. So very relevant for a lot of people. But importantly, there's still time to modify your nutrition strategies and practices before then. So actually, I'm not dropping this on you a week before London, where actually you run out of time to make any changes and practice things in training. So hopefully you can use some of this information I share to really help your marathon performance. And then another reason why I've chosen to tackle marathon fueling in this first episode is that actually it's one of the areas where sports science, I think, really has made a difference. And I think a lot of the times, actually, the improvements we see in world records and changes in personal best performances, as well as shoe technology, I think it's over the last, if we're talking decades, it's down to training practice, I think, and most of the time that actually tends to be worked out by coaches and athletes just through trial and error. But I think sports nutrition actually is somewhere where research really has affected the practices of elite athletes. But at the same time, I still don't think it's poorly understood, maybe even by some really high level athletes, to be honest. I've seen nutrition practices by even athletes of the Commonwealth Games. I was there supporting athletes at the marathon. I was on one of the drink stations, and actually there's still room for improvement in some of these athletes who are, competing for their country. So I think, although I think the scientific community has got quite a strong consensus of what we think and what we know to be optimal, I don't think it always gets translated into practice. And so I think it's a good area to cover, and actually has the potential to really make a difference to marathon times. Now, I think you could ask the question, how much difference does it make? And I tried to do a bit of reading on this, but actually it was hard to get. It's hard to get a clear cut. Okay, this is how taking on energy drinks, etc., is going to improve your marathon time by X%. It's hard to get a number on that. Now, I did find a review article which compared, got together 5 studies that looked at taking on carbohydrates or a placebo, so basically a sweetened energy drink which didn't actually have any carbohydrates in it. And they found a 4 to 10% improvement in time trial performance in runners. Now, in minutes, if we take a 3-hour marathon runner, that'd be like 4% would equate to 7-minute improvement in marathon performance. At 10% would be 18 minutes improvement in marathon performance. Now, intuitively, I don't think you're gaining 18 minutes on marathon performance taking energy carbohydrates on during a race compared to taking on water or placebo. I would say maybe it's close to 7 minutes, and it's probably going to be some really individual variation depending on how fast you're running, the type of athlete you are, how well you conditioned you are for the event. But intuitively, I do think that that 5 to 10 minute difference, depending on the athlete, and taking on a really optimized nutrition strategy compared to taking on nothing, I think that's probably like fair. I think it's pretty like ballpark right. So it really has got the ability to make a big difference to marathon times. And especially actually if you think about how much training it would take to achieve similar improvements in marathon time. So I definitely think that it's a place where you can make some easy wins, really, with just a bit of practice and some knowledge. So that's why I chose this topic today, and hopefully you're going to find this interesting. Now, before we get into like the real details, I think we need a bit of background on exercise metabolism, or actually how do we burn fuels to produce the energy we need for muscle contraction to make us run, basically. Now, we're not going to go too deep. We don't need to be be experts in biochemistry, but I think having a bit of understanding really helps. And you'll probably know a lot of this already. But really, there are two main fuels that we use when we exercise: carbohydrates and fats. Now, there can be some protein. Some protein being used as metabolized as a fuel source, but this is really, it only happens when we really have got a lot of muscle breakdown and we've really exhausted our fuel stores. And actually, in practical terms, during a marathon, we're basically going to be relying on a mixture of carbohydrates and fats. Now, fat has got the advantage of the fact that we have almost an infinite supply of fat. Nobody is going to run out of fat stores when they're exercising. Even some of these borderline underweight elite marathon runners who have probably got body fat percentages of 5-6% and are arguably too low sometimes, even those athletes have got plenty enough fat to run multiple marathons back to back to back if they had to. So that's a great advantage for fat. And fat is stored in adipose tissue, in our fat tissue. That's more that superficial fat we can think of. But also there's actually fat stores within the muscle fibers themselves. And these are these fat stores are obviously, because they're at the site where they're needed for metabolism and energy breakdown, these are really useful stores of fat. Now, the cons of fat is that it's slow to break down, so we can't break it down super quickly, which means that when we want to run at faster intensities, fat no longer becomes the fuel source of choice, because we just can't break it down quick enough to produce energy quick enough of the rate of energy turnover we need to run at higher intensities. So that's one downside to fat. And another is it's less economical. And by that, I mean that actually to produce the same amount of energy as we'd get from breaking out carbohydrate, we need to breathe in more oxygen. So, for example, if I was running a 6-minute mile pace, I would need to breathe in more oxygen if I was burning just fat as a fuel source compared to if I was burning just carbohydrates as a fuel source. And this becomes an issue, especially as you get towards higher intensities, because it's going to mean that instead of working at, for example, 70% of our VO2 max, if we were burning all carbohydrates, we now might be at 75% if we're burning fats. And that's going to mean that actually we're working at a higher intensity, it's going to feel harder, and it's going to be not as sustainable for as long. So that's sort of like why, fats are great. They're a great source of energy. Like, we've got almost infinite supply, but less economical, and we can't break them down as quickly. So they're not as good for more high intensity running. Now, maybe it doesn't matter if you're a bit less economical if you are working at low intensities, but the faster you go, the difference between, the difference between 70 and 75% of VO2 max isn't that much. But actually, if we're talking about the difference between 85 and 90% of VO2 max, now that's going to be quite meaningful. That's going to feel a lot harder, and it's going to have you're not going to be able to sustain that intensity for nearly as long. So that's where actually takes us to our second fuel choice, which is carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are stored as glycogen within our muscle fibers themselves, but also within the liver. So we can use that as a fuel source, but we can also burn blood glucose. So the glucose that's in our blood, we can take that out of our muscle fibers are really good at snatching glucose out of that blood, especially during exercise when there's a real need for glucose. Muscles are really good at pulling that glucose out of the blood and using it as a fuel source. So that's where we can get our carbohydrates from. Glycogen, which is where we store our carbohydrates in the body, so in the liver, which can then be broken down. The glycogen in the liver can be broken down and actually be used to maintain that blood glucose levels at appropriate levels, as well as that glycogen that we've got in our muscles, which is going to stay in our muscles and be broken down in our muscles because that's actually where it's needed. So as I've alluded to already, burning either blood glucose or glycogen is more economical. We don't need as much oxygen to burn to create the same amount of energy from carbohydrate stores as we do when we're using fat stores. So that's a big tick. But the cons, which most people know, is that actually our glycogen stores are limited. So we only have a certain amount of glycogen that we can store within our muscle fibers and in our liver. And it's about 2,000 calories, give or take, depending on the size of the athlete, how much muscle mass you have, what diet you take on regularly. But let's say, for example, that it's about 2,000 calories, which unfortunately isn't quite enough to get us all the way to the end of a marathon. So an economical person, someone who's quite economical, will burn about 100 calories a mile. So it's going to take them about 2,600 calories to run the 26.2 miles of a marathon. Now, if we've only got 2,000 calories roughly worth of glycogen stores, then that's not quite enough to get us to the finish line. So that means that we're going to have to use a mix of carbohydrates and fats to get us to the end of a marathon before exhaustion. So what happens if we do deplete our carbohydrate stores too quickly? So with our glycogen stores are nearly empty, and our blood glucose is actually, maybe we can't maintain that blood glucose levels sufficiently because actually we've also depleted that liver glycogen. Well, then what happens is we switch to fats, and that is going to mean that we are now less economical, and we also can't maintain those same intensities that we did at the start. So maybe at the start of a marathon we could maintain 85% of our VO2 max, but actually we've depleted our glycogen stores. We can no longer sustain those high intensities, and actually now we're having to run at 70% of VO2 max, and that's as hard as we can go. And actually, you can see this really clearly actually in the heart rate traces of people who have paced a marathon well compared to ones who have really hit the wall and fallen off a cliff. And you'll see that actually in those runners where they've paced the marathon really well and spread the effort evenly over the course of a marathon, their heart rate is just going to slowly drift all the way up until they hit about max at the end of a marathon. Maybe not quite max, but getting pretty close to max. Whereas in someone who's hit the wall completely, heart rate's going to rise much more quickly, and it's going to get to quite a high level, probably not max, at about somewhere, probably depending on how well you pace it. Let's say you start to really fade after 18 miles. So it's going to keep climbing all the way up to 18 miles. But then it's actually going to fall because they can't maintain that exercise intensity high enough because they've really depleted their glycogen stores. And actually, for the last 10k of a marathon, their heart rate won't be necessarily as high as as it was at the start. And actually, it won't be, although the heart rate is going to be much higher than you'd expect for the pace that they're running at, because they're less economical. They need more oxygen, and need to pump their heart harder to distribute that oxygen to the muscles. So their heart rate is higher than you'd expect for the pace if they were fresh. It's actually not as high as as it was at the start of the race. And if you compare like the average heart rate between that person who paced it well compared to the person who's hit the wall and really struggled over the last 10k, then actually the one who paced it well is going to have a higher average heart rate for the whole marathon. So that's a nice way that you can just demonstrate it just by using some simple heart rate data. And obviously the other thing that happens if you deplete your carbohydrate stores too quickly is that you're going to be very fatigued. And part of that is that you're going to get a feedback signal from the muscles to the brain to say that I'm fatigued. But also if blood glucose starts to fall, then the brain, its preferential fuel type is glucose, and it's works far better burning glucose than it does than fat. And so actually the brain is going to register that blood glucose is falling, and it's going to translate into actually fatigue even before glycogen levels become completely exhausted. So hopefully then it's pretty clear that the goal is to ensure that we're burning as much carbohydrate as we can, with the aim that actually we deplete carbohydrate as we cross the finish line. Now, obviously, it's not even if you're complete, you've hit the wall, your carbohydrate, your glycogen stores aren't completely empty. There'll be a little bit left in the tank, because it's impossible basically to completely run with 100% dry. Your brain is very good at protecting itself and will make you fatigue before you get to that point. But we want to basically hit the wall, if you like, at or just after the finish line, so that we've can burn as much carbohydrate as we can, because that's going to mean that we can run at higher intensities and we're going to be more economical. Now, there's a few ways that we can help do this. First is pacing, because the intensity is the main thing that dictates whether we use carbohydrates or fats as a fuel source. If we're running at low intensities, we're going to use more fat. Now, as we graduate towards higher intensities, it becomes almost exclusively carbohydrates. So everyone knows that pacing in a marathon is really, really important. And the main reason why for this is because actually we can start to deplete our glycogen stores too quickly if we're running at those high intensities early on, higher intensities than actually we can sustain. So that's the first thing, is getting that pacing balance right, and actually making sure that we're in a place where we are going to be mostly using carbohydrates as a fuel source, but actually we need enough to be metabolizing enough fat so that actually we can eke out that carbohydrate use over the course of the 26.2 miles, 42.2 kilometers. So that's one key thing, is pacing. The second thing we can do, which is the topic of this episode, is take on carbohydrates during the race. So obviously we want to make sure that our glycogen levels are topped up before the race even begins, so that actually in a couple of days beforehand we're eating a high carbohydrate diet, and that actually we've had a carbohydrate rich breakfast in the morning a few hours before, to make sure we've had time to absorb that carbohydrate, digest it, and then store it as muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. But we can also take on carbohydrates during the race. And that's going to help us in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's going to keep that blood glucose really high. And as I said earlier, the muscles are great at pulling glucose out of the blood and burning it as a fuel. Especially when we exercise. Actually, as we exercise, the muscles are really clever, and they send glucose transporters or glucose channels to the outside of the muscle fibers, where there's a muscle blood interface, and that means that the wall of the muscle fiber becomes even more porous to glucose, and so it's really good at sucking that glucose out of the blood and into the muscle, where it can be used by the mitochondria to produce energy. So that's one thing. So that's going to mean that we're going to be more economical because we're burning more carbohydrates and relying less on fat. But that's also going to mean that it reduces our rate of glycogen breakdown, because if we're getting our glucose from the blood rather than having to break down glycogen during the first, during the opening half marathon, 20 miles, then that's going to mean that we can eke out our glycogen to last us over the whole 26.2 miles. And again, as I said, that's going to mean that we can run at higher intensities and be more economical. Now, hopefully I've convinced you then that, carbohydrates, they're the king. That's where we need to go. We basically want to oxidize or break down as much carbohydrate as we can during the marathon, with the caveat that we don't deplete our glycogen stores too much before we get to the end. So now we'll move on to actually how much carbohydrate can we take on during a marathon. And actually, the main limiting factor to how much we can take on, how much carbohydrate we can absorb and use in the muscles, is how good we are at absorbing carbohydrates from the intestines. So it's not how much the muscles can use. The muscles are great at burning fuels. That's how they're designed. We've got lots of mitochondria. We have lots of aerobic enzymes that are great at burning fuels. Our blood is great at distributing it to the muscles really quickly. But what the limiting factor is how quickly we can get the carbohydrates out of our intestines and into the bloodstream. And for glucose, so it's a simple sugar molecule, glucose, we can take out about 60 grams an hour from our intestine and get it to our muscles and metabolize it as a fuel source. And for a long time, that's what we thought was the optimal amount that we should take on. But actually the ceiling, if you like, for how much carbohydrate we could take on during an exercise was about 60 grams an hour. And that was what recommendations were for many years. But actually, it's since been discovered that there are other types of, we've known for a long time, that other types of carbohydrate exist. So we've got glucose, but there's also other similar carbohydrate molecules, such as fructose, sucrose, etc., which are very similar, but more importantly, they have different carbohydrate channels for absorption in the intestines. So similar to with muscle, where we've got carbohydrate transporters and channels that can pull glucose out of the blood and into the muscle fibers, the same happens in the gut. And we now know that there are different channels depending on the type of carbohydrate that is in the intestines. So these different channels, these transporters, there are ones that take up glucose, and there are ones that other channels that will take up different types of carbohydrates, such as fructose. And we now know that actually, if we use a mix of an energy source that's got a mix of glucose and another type of carbohydrate, such as fructose, then we can increase the amount of a rate of carbohydrate absorption. And in this case, it's about, the ceiling seems to be about, for runners at least, 90 grams an hour. Now it's going to depend a little bit on the individual, and we'll talk about why that might be the case a bit later on in the show, but that's, as a ballpark, the recommendations now is trying to get as close as we can to 90 grams an hour of carbohydrate taking on during exercise, if we're using a mixture of fuel types. And commonly, energy drinks, energy gels now will have a mixture of either glucose and fructose or maltodextrin and fructose, because these use different transporters in the intestine to get into the blood. So what does 90 grams an hour actually translate to in terms of gels, which are what most people probably are using during a marathon? Certainly in a mass field where you don't have your own drink station. Well, let's take a typical gel that's got about 22 grams of carbohydrates in each one, which is what SIS Go has. So they're probably one of the most common gels out there, the SIS Go brands, which like their basic gel. They've got 22 grams in. So if you're a 3-hour marathon runner and you want to take on 90 grams an hour of carbohydrates, you would need 11 of those gels. So that's a really high rate of gel intake. And I very much doubt that the typical athlete is taking on 11 gels during a 3-hour marathon, which shows you that there's probably room for improvement there. Now, before I move on, I'd like to highlight is actually saying that actually in most energy drinks, most sports gels have these days a mix of either glucose and fructose or maltodextrin and fructose. The SIS Go does not have a mix of fuel types. It is just glucose, or it might just be maltodextrin. It's just one fuel type anyway. So actually that means that it would be quite difficult, and probably you probably have quite a lot of gastric distress, GI symptoms, if you tried to take on 90 grams an hour using that particular gel. So I think it's really worth actually looking at the fuels that you are taking on and ensuring that they are a mixture of 2 different fuel types. And mostly there'll be glucose and fructose, which is what the Maurten gels are. Or in the case of the higher range SIS gels, which are the SIS Beta Fuel gels, they are maltodextrin and fructose. So really worth checking the type of gels that you're taking on, and drinks that you're taking on during your marathons. And now another caveat is that I said that 90 grams an hour should be the target, but actually there are a few things that you're going to need to do to be able to hit that 90 grams an hour. Now we've mentioned one, and the first is choose the right fuel type. You want an energy drink, an energy gel that's got a mixture of either glucose and fructose, or probably maltodextrin and fructose. So we've covered that already. But another one that's really important is actually taking on carbohydrates in our diet generally. So if you've got a high carbohydrate diet, then that's going to increase the amount of carbohydrate transporters that we have in our intestines. Now we also, as well as, and most runners are going to have a high carbohydrate diet anyway. Most Western people from the West have a high carbohydrate diet anyway. But a second factor is taking on carbohydrates whilst we're exercising. And again, that has been shown to increase the amount of carbohydrate transporters that we have in our intestine. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important just to practice with our intended nutrition strategy that we're going to use in the marathon. We need to do that in training as well. Because not just are we going to just get used to the idea of ripping open a gel sachet or taking on liquid on the move, but also it's going to expose our intestine to carbohydrates when it's under some sort of stress, and then it's going to respond to that, adapt to that by increasing the amount of transporters. So the next time it's going to be better adapted to pulling carbohydrate out of the intestine and into the blood. Now, another factor that's going to affect actually how well we tolerate these fuels is the frequency of which we take them on. There's multiple ways you could take on 90 grams an hour. You could take every hour, you could take on 90 grams of carbohydrates, which would be, you could smash two and a half gels if they've got a high carbohydrate content. So for example, the SIS Beta Fuel and the Maurten gels that I mentioned earlier, they've both got 40 grams of carbohydrate on. So you could do two gels of that basically every hour. And that would be one way of taking on 90 grams an hour. but actually it's much better to increase the frequency. Now, most marathons will have energy stations every 5k, and elite drinks tables for the elite athletes are normally every 5k. But interestingly, one of the strategies that Eliud Kipchoge employed during the Breaking 2 attempts was that he was actually given his drink every mile. Now that means you don't have to take on as much in one go. So you don't have to take on, for example, 250 ml of sports drink. You could take on just 50 ml if you did it every mile. Those approximate numbers. So it means we don't have to take on as much at a time, which is going to mean that it's actually it's going to be a more evenly distributed, even distribution of carbohydrates getting to your intestine. It's going to be a gradual flow than a shock every 18-20 minutes or so, being given just a massive bolus of carbohydrates. So that's probably going to help with the absorption, but it's also going to mean there's a more continuous stream of glucose being delivered to your muscles as well. So frequency is really important. And that's going to, I guess the frequency is often going to depend upon actually the practicalities of are you giving a bottle every 5k, or are you taking your own gels? And actually with the gels, it's also hard to take half a gel at a time. So actually you are going to be dictated a little bit with your frequency by the practicalities of your situation and what you've got available to you. But it is something that's worth bearing in mind, that higher frequencies are going to be better. Little and often is going to be much better than taking on big amounts of carbohydrates at less frequent intervals. So there are some ways that you can improve your tolerance for carbohydrates, but you also need to be aware there are things that can reduce your tolerance for taking on energy whilst you're exercising. Now, firstly, actually just the mode of exercise is important. So we're talking about marathon running here, and we're saying for that, it's normally about 90 grams an hour of carbohydrates is about the limit of what we can take on. But cyclists, for example, sometimes take on as much as 120 grams per hour. These are the elite cyclists competing at the Tour de France. So the mode of exercise is important, probably for a number of reasons. You're much more stationary on a bike compared to running. Just the up and down movement is going to give you a bit of an upset tummy and make it harder to absorb fuel. But it also there's probably going to be another factor is how well your gut, your intestines are perfused with blood. Because what happens when you exercise is that blood is distributed to where it's most needed. So obviously when you're running, your need for oxygen in your muscles, in your legs is going to go up several folds compared to when you're resting. And so the body's really clever. It's going to direct oxygen-rich blood towards working muscles. But it also needs to decide that actually, when we're running along, we don't need to focus on digesting food as much. That's not what we do that when we're resting, not when we're exercising. And so it diverts blood away from the intestines and the gut and the stomach. And that's going to mean that actually it's our intestines aren't going to be as good at absorbing energy, fuel sources, carbohydrates, and it's going to find this more difficult, and so we won't be able to do it as efficiently. So actually gut perfusion is really important. And the two factors that are most important for actually how well perfused our gut is are the intensity of exercise we're running at, but also the temperature. Now, intensity, that's going to have a big factor for the elite level runners who are running low 2-hour marathons. They are running a much higher intensity than the athlete who's taking 4 hours to run the marathon. And that means actually the elite athletes are going to find it more difficult to take on carbohydrates during their race compared to the slower people. So in that situation, the slower you are, you're actually an advantage in terms of being able to take on your fuel more effectively. And actually also highlights that for the elite athlete, they really need to practice in training to make sure that they're really tuned in with how much that they can tolerate at race pace. So yeah, as I said, the second factor is heat. So actually, the hotter it is, then the more challenging it is to take on carbohydrates during exercise. And that's because more blood is taken away from the intestines and it's distributed to the skin to help with cooling. So we can actually, our blood is going to be pretty much core body temperature, 37 degrees, 36.5 degrees, maybe a bit higher, maybe when we're exercising, 38, 39, hopefully not too much past 40, otherwise we're going to run into difficulty. But it's going to take this hot blood, take it to the surface of our skin where it can be released into the environment. That's going to help with cooling. But at the same time, that's going to impact on our ability to take on carbohydrates. So I think the message there is actually if you're running higher intensities, so you're running at faster speeds, then it's going to be more difficult to take on energy during your marathon. But also, actually, if it's a hot day, you may also struggle and you may have to dial back your nutritional strategy, your nutrition plan, and take on maybe slightly less than you were planning to. If, for example, you've been training for London Marathon in April and you've had lots of lovely training conditions where your long runs have all been at 5 degrees, 10 degrees, nice running temperatures, but actually you get to April and it's the first hot day of the year and it's 25 degrees. In that case, as well as dialing back on your pace, you may need to dial back on your nutrition strategy and maybe take on slightly less carbohydrates. So that brings us on to actually what fuel types. There are many different types of fuel we can take on. Basically, we can have solids, bars, for example. We can have gels, or we can have liquids. Now, what should we choose there? Which is the best one? Which one is best for carbohydrate absorption? And it's probably pretty intuitive, but actually liquids are easier to absorb than gels or solids. So it's liquids are the most easy to absorb. Gels still quite good, but actually it's not quite as easy to absorb than liquids, and then solids are more difficult to break down and to absorb that carbohydrate out of the intestines and into the blood. However, if you haven't got elite drinks, then it becomes very difficult to take on liquids during the marathon. So the elites are very lucky in that they get often, like as I said earlier, there'll be a drinks table every 5K, and they can have whatever they want on that table. They can have a bottle, they can have a bottle of gels. Now, my recommendation, if you're in that situation, is to go with the liquids because it's more easy to absorb, but you're also getting fluids as well, which is going to help maintain your hydration status. We don't want to become, a little bit of dehydration is fine, but we don't want to become too dehydrated because that's going to thicken the bloods. It's going to make it harder to pump blood around the system and deliver oxygen to the muscles. So if it was me and what I do, if I've got access to elite drinks, liquids all the way, okay? Now, gels are a good option, especially if you're going to have to carry your fuel because they are much lighter than taking liquids. They're more concentrated. Like there's 40 grams per carbohydrate in a single gel if you've got the top range ones, and that's in 60 ml of fluid. So it's much easier to take that round the marathon and carry that with you than taking a hydration pack, for example. And weight is a big factor again when it comes to marathon racing and running performance. So for the vast majority of people, I think gels are probably the way to go because you can carry them, and you can also practice with the nutrition that you're going to use in the race in training as well. So you can really dial in what you're going to use. Now solids are an option. You can have bars, but I think where they can be probably more useful is that people who are running slower marathons because, as I said, solids are harder to break down. You've got to actually physically break down the components of a bar into glucose molecules in your stomach and in your intestine, and that's going to take longer, and it's going to require better perfusion of your intestines and gut and stomach. Now, if you look at Tour de France riders, they often actually start with solids, where at the start of a race, where it's actually the intensity isn't too high. They transition to gels when things are starting to heat up a bit and actually the intensity is rising. And at the end, when actually they can be pretty close to VO2 max or really quite high intensities, that's when they transition to just liquids. So that is an option, potentially if you're a slower runner, or if maybe actually we're not talking about a marathon anymore, we're talking about an ultra event where actually instead of running for 3 hours, maybe you're running for 6+ hours. Now in that case, solids might be an option, especially at the early part of the race. But I think there's my preference in terms of actually if you've got access to it, will be to go liquids. If you can't do liquids, take on gels. If you can't take gels, most of the time you'll be able to take on gels. But if you couldn't take on gels or you really don't get on with them very well, then maybe solids would be an option to try. So I think that covers fuel types. I think now it's really just like let's sort of talk through a step-by-step guide of how we would create our own nutrition strategy, for the race, but also in the build-up to getting to that race. As I mentioned earlier, practicing is going to be really important in training. Because we can improve our ability to absorb carbohydrates with practice, but also it gives us a really good idea of, we can help quantify actually and work out our nutritional strategy for race day. And we can get actually, although I've given you that guideline of actually we should aim to shoot for 90 grams an hour, you might be particularly good at absorbing carbohydrates, and you might be able to take on 100 grams per hour. Or on the other hand, you might be someone who struggles a bit with taking on nutrition, and maybe you can only tolerate 70 grams per hour without getting gastric distress. And that's worth mentioning now, actually, that if you're not able to absorb that carbohydrate that's in your intestines, say you've taken on 120 grams an hour, but actually your body's only capable of absorbing 90 grams, then you're going to have experiences such as being nauseous. You might actually be sick. You're going to have reflux. And that's going to obviously not be ideal. It's not going to be beneficial for your running performance. And so actually, if you're experiencing those symptoms, it probably means that you're not fully absorbing all of that carbohydrate that you're taking on. So I think, as I said, first thing to do is practice it in training. And ideally, you want to be doing it at stuff which is going to be reasonably close to the intensity and the duration that you're going to be operating at during the marathon. So, for example, it could be during a marathon pace tempo where you do 13 miles at marathon pace. But one downside to that is actually you're only taking it on for half the duration that you will be taking on fuel during the actual marathon. So I think my preference would be to do it in a long run, slightly slower than marathon pace. So the intensity is only slightly slower, but you're taking on fuel for say 2 hours, 2+ hours of duration, because actually it's much easier to take on carbohydrates for an hour than it is for doing it for 2 or 3 hours. So my recommendations will be doing it in a 20 mile or whatever your longest runs are, which are just a bit slower than marathon pace. So maybe it's 20 to 30 seconds per mile slower than marathon pace. And that's going to really give you as well as giving you a really good training stimulus and close to a marathon, it's also going to give you a good idea of actually how much carbohydrate can you take on at marathon intensity. Now, hopefully you've got a few of these runs planned over the course of your marathon build-up. And to start with, I'll be really conservative, especially if you haven't taken on carbohydrates before. And I would really plan it out. I would have say that you are going to take on gels, and you're going to take a gel you've worked out that, sorry, I start that again. You say you're going to take gels. Let's start with taking on just 40 grams an hour of carbohydrates. Okay, so if we take one of these fancy new gels like the SIS Beta Fuel or Maurten, I'm not sponsored by either, by the way. I tend to use the SIS Beta just out of preference. I think it tastes a bit better than the Maurten gels, but I find a gel that's got a carbohydrate multidextrin, a fructose multidextrin or glucose fructose mix, and we're going to start off with just taking 40 grams an hour. So that's one gel every hour. Now, hopefully that should be very tolerable for you. But what I would do is I would be really strict, take that on every hour of your long run, and record your symptoms. Like 1 out of 10, how much discomfort were you in? Were you experiencing reflux, nausea, vomiting? If there were some symptoms, that's fine. Just note them down. Okay, it was 5 out of 10. But I think the key is if you can still do the session, then that's great. That means that if you're having some symptoms, it's probably a good feedback to you that you are stressing the gut by taking on that amount of carbohydrate. And that means that you're probably going to have a bit of a training stimulus there, and actually you're going to upregulate the amount of carbohydrate transporters you've got in the gut, and the next time, hopefully, it'll be more tolerable. So in that example, we've done our 20-mile long run, we've taken on 40 grams an hour, you've had no negative symptoms. Great. Right, next time, let's try 60 grams an hour. Same thing. Right, let's record our symptoms. Okay, now we're having some negative symptoms, but actually it's only a 3 out of 10. Okay, you still could do the run fine. You just had a bit of reflux in the final half an hour. Okay, right, that's fine. Right, a bit of reflux is okay. You still managed to do the long run. Let's try 80 grams next time. Now, 80 grams might actually be that you're having severe symptoms, and that you could do the run, but only just because you actually felt quite sick, and it was really affecting your performance. Well, next time, okay, let's try the same again and see if that gets any better. If it doesn't get any better, then maybe you want to dial it slightly back, 70 grams an hour, and that's the strategy you're going to use for your marathon race day. But I think what you really want is to be really confident in your nutrition strategy when you arrive at the marathon. So I think that's it really for my step-by-step guide, my tips of actually marathon fueling. Just to summarize, carbohydrates are king. We want to burn as much carbohydrate as we can, with the caveat that we don't run out before the finish line. We want to aim for about 90 grams an hour, but actually you're going to have to find out what works best for you in person. Choosing the right fuel sources is going to really set you up nicely. So find something, whether it be gels or drinks, that have got a mix of 2 different types of carbohydrate, most commonly glucose and fructose, or multidextrin and fructose. And practice it in training and really go through that really careful graded approach. Really work out actually how much you're going to take on during your training run the night before. So if you're using gels, then know how frequently you need to take those gels. Is it every 30 minutes? Is it every 25 minutes? And be really strict at taking them on during your run. If you're using drinks, if you're lucky enough to have your own drinks, then I will measure it out the night before. I will go, okay, I need to take on 200 ml every 25 minutes, or to get 90 grams an hour, or and I'll be really strict with measuring actually how much should I drink and how much should I take on. And it becomes a little bit more difficult with the planning for drinks, because you don't want to carry those drinks with you. I will just do a loop back to my house every 5k, or I'll park my car up with lots of bottles put on my roof, and I'll just keep doing a loop back to the car, and I will pick that bottle up, drink all of it, and then go off, do another loop, come back. And I'll make sure if I haven't drunk all of the bottles, I'll record how much I've not drunk so that I can how much is left in the bottle, so I can work out how much carbohydrate have I actually taken on during the run. So that's the summary there. I'm going to put a few references in the show notes for key papers. I haven't referenced any really during this podcast, but I'm going to put some of this research that I've done just preparing this. I'll post links to them in the show notes. But I also said I was going to direct you to experts in the field, and I've got two experts for you today. The first is Louise Burke. You can find her on Twitter, but I'll also link to it again in the show notes. She's a nutritionist who used to work with the Australian Institute for Sport, but is also a researcher and has done some of the cutting edge research in the field. She's done a lot specifically with endurance athletes, and has done a lot of the work looking at actually how can we improve nutrition uptake, but also how can we periodize our nutrition over the course of a training block. So she's someone really worth following. And the second is Trent Stellingworth, who is a Canadian. Very similarly, works at the Canadian Institute for Sport, but also does some fantastic research himself. Again, available. You can find him on Twitter, and he's produced some great stuff. And has really produced and shares some really interesting stuff on Twitter too. So I definitely recommend following him. So that's it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed. Feedback is always really appreciative. This is my first ever podcast, so I'm sure that I've got plenty of stuff to work on. Follow me on Twitter if you don't already. That's where I'll be publicising stuff, and I try and share interesting things. If you're interested in my own training, I'm currently preparing for the European 50-kilometre Championships in October, which are going to be in Spain. You can see all my training on Strava. That's where I'd probably follow me. I'm on Instagram, but I'm not that interesting and don't take great photos. So yeah, I hope everyone has a fantastic week of training, and I'll try and get another podcast out soon. If you've got something you'd really like to learn more about, then also send that over to me, and I'll put it into my list of potential topics. So yeah, have a great week, everybody. Bye. I hope you've enjoyed.